Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. We welcome you to this conversation between Professor Angela Davis and Professor Ilan Pappé. My name is Katie Natanel and I'm a lecturer in gender studies at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter. I'm here to chair this meeting and do some of the introductory work. And with me is my co-chair, Asha Ali, who will introduce herself.
Hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Asha Ali, and I'm a third year Middle Eastern student at the Institute of Islamic and Arabic Studies.
Wonderful. Thank you, Asha. We have a few things to attend to before we start this conversation. The first is to say thank you to quite a lot of people, but we'll do it as quickly as we can. Thank you to those who are hosting and sponsoring and organizing this event at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies, the European Center for Palestine Studies, and the Exeter Decolonizing Network, who I think altogether it is a formidable force here in Exeter. Thank you as well to the amazing team behind this event. It's taken a lot of people, a lot of love, a lot of time. So thank you to Cassandra Shaler, to Lara Choksi, to Andrea Wallace, Abe Foley, Malcolm Richards, Nehas Shaji, Sajad Rizvi, Gareth Stansfield, Melanie Shaw, Toby Squire, and the University IT and events teams, and also the Exeter Decolonizing Network student fellows who are working with us on a project around decolonizing knowledge production and anti-racist pedagogies. Thank you as well to our audience who is joining us today. It is truly a global audience, which is an amazing thing. And last but not least, thank you to our speakers. Thank you to Asha, who is here again co-chairing with me. Thank you to Professor Angela Davis, and thank you to Ilan Pappé. So you know why you are here tonight. Tonight we are here to listen, to learn, to engage, and to act. This event has been a long time in the making. For me, it's been, For me, it's been since September that we've been working on coordinating this. For Asha, it has been over 2 years, so quite a while. We invited Professor Davis and Professor Pape to speak to us about the past, the present, and the future, about struggles for justice and transformation that span spaces, times, and communities. For many of us, there is an acute feeling that we're living in precarious conditions, that inequality is growing and injustices are becoming entrenched. And the effects of this are not abstract or theoretical. The cost of this is lives. But it is not a time without hope, nor is it a time without action. So today we will trace connections between anti-racist, anti-colonial, feminist, and student movements, at the very least, that will provide us with tools to collectively build and fight for a better future. After some brief introductions, we will have this amazing conversation between Professor Davis and Professor Pape. At 7 p.m., that conversation will stop and we will invite questions from the audience. This is an audience here with us on Zoom and also on YouTube. Asha will tell you how to participate in terms of offering comments and questions, and we'll close at 7:30. Asha, I'll hand to you.
Thank you again. Please, if you want, keep your cameras on or off. And if you want your identity to be anonymous, since we are live streaming this, please feel free to change your name. Comments and questions are invited through the chat function on Zoom and on YouTube, and it will be moderated between myself and Katie. We are using the hashtag DavisPape2021. So if you want to hold a conversation on Twitter, please feel free to do so. Lastly, please behave and speak as you would in person. Everyone in the world is experiencing difficult times, and kindness goes a long way. Katie, over to you.
Great. So now we will introduce our speakers. It is an absolute pleasure to introduce Professor Ilan Pappé. Ilan is the Professor of History and the Director of the European Center for Palestine Studies here at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies. As I wrote in his bio, which many of you have read, Ilan is an expatriate Israeli historian and socialist activist. His research contextualizes the history of Palestine into a larger global context of settler colonialism and challenges the dominant Israeli narrative. Ilan has been part of countless campaigns and actions, and most recently became a founding member of the new movement, the One Democratic State Initiative. Ilan is this, and he is so much more, and I've warned him, I might cry. His meticulous research, his critiques, and his courage have deeply informed movements for transformation in Palestine and beyond. Ilan is a tireless advocate for justice. From experience and also from observation, I can say that he inspires new generations of activist scholars who see their work as inseparable from the struggle for better societies. And this is the struggle for material, social, political, and cultural conditions that benefit the many rather than the few. For Ilan, this is achieved not from the top down, but from the bottom up. As a colleague, this might be the quality that stands out most clearly, what shines most brightly. For Ilan, everyone matters. He's never too big or too busy to give you a warm hello by the printer, to support and advocate for students who are facing persecution, to join actions that aim to change our campuses and communities, and to imagine and to work toward new futures, no matter how small the seed of an idea. He is just and he is kind. And this is the fullness of Ilan that you will see and you will hear tonight. He is the author of the best-selling The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, A History of Modern Palestine, The Israel-Palestine Question, The Forgotten Palestinians, The Idea of Israel, and co-authored 2 books with Noam Chomsky, The War on Gaza and On Palestine. His 2016 book, The Biggest Prison on Earth, A History of the Occupied Territories, received the Palestine Book Award. Ilan, it is an absolute privilege and an absolute honor to learn from you. Asha?
I can't believe I get to introduce Angela Davis. So, Angela Y. Davis, Distinguished Professor Emerita of History of Consciousness and Feminist Studies, UCSC, is known internationally for her ongoing work to combat all forms of oppressions in the US and abroad. Over the years, she has been active as a student, teacher, writer, scholar, and activist, as well as an organizer. He's a living witness to the historical struggles of the contemporary era. Davis emerged as a leading activist in the 1960s in the Communist Party USA and had close relations with the Black Panther Party through her involvement in the civil rights movement. During the past 50 years, she has continued to be at the cutting edge of radical thought, prison abolition, and movement organizing. He is a founding member of Critical Resistance, a national organization dedicated to the dismantling of the prison industrial complex. Internationally, she's affiliated with Sisters Inside, an abolitionist organization based in Queensland, Australia, that works in solidarity with women in prison. She is a voice to whom academics and activists turn for inspiration and razor-sharp analysis of power, from racism to heterosexism and neoliberal capitalism. Her works include Woman, Race and Class, Are Prisons Obsolete?, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, Vegas in Palestine and the Foundation of Movement and the Meaning of Freedom, and other difficult dialogues. Firstly, happy belated birthday, Professor Angela Davis. And we should also not forget that on October 13th, 2020, it was 50 years since Professor Davis' arrest. I told a friend of mine in London about this event, and she reminded me how I used to carry your book, Woman, Race and Class, around. All my friends would tease me because I could barely understand your book. I had no formal educational background at the time, yet I would take it with me everywhere, to parties, to gathering, and ask others if they knew about you. They would laugh and say that they were more concerned with surviving and getting their hustle on than reading your book. At the time, around the age of 18, 19, I did not know what the words feminism or abolitionist meant. But your work opened a world for me that I did not know existed and thought it was possible. It greatly empowered me to think for myself and to also link my struggles with the struggles of other oppressed people around the world. And for that, I will forever be grateful. Professor Angela Davis.
Thank you.
Wonderful. With that, we hand the floor to you.
Hi. Okay. Thank you everyone who took part in it and making it possible. And thank you for everyone who's watching us and listening for us. And Angela, it's such a great pleasure and a great honor to have you with us. Our colleagues and students, have been looking forward to such a meeting for a very long time, as Katie has mentioned in her introduction, and are all thrilled to hear you. We wanted to have you in Exeter if it was possible, but given the circumstances, we are very happy that at least we have this opportunity, be it online, to hear you and talk to you and find out what are your views on many issues that interest us, trouble us, and concern us for many years. Your stance, your career, your courage is for us, especially in the European Center for Palestine Studies, a model for how to fuse activism with scholarship, moral commitment with professionalism, without fear and without caving in to intimidation and persecution, which we sometimes as a unit, and I know you as a scholar and activist, are regularly facing because of our principles, values, and moral stances. I think everybody would love us to begin our conversation, Angela, with your thoughts about what happened in the United States on the 6th of January on Capitol Hill. What is your assessment of this event, and how do you sort of contextualize it in America today and in the future?
Well, first of all, let me tell you, Ilan, what an honor it is to meet you. Finally, after reading your work and following your career. And let me thank Katie and Asha and the Institute for Arab and Islamic Studies, as well as the European Center for Palestine Studies, which you had, and the Exeter Decolonizing Network. So to venture a response to your question, I would begin by saying that I was shocked, of course, by this display of organized white supremacist violence, but I cannot say that I was entirely surprised. I interpret this attempted insurrection instigated by the 45th president of the US, who fortunately is no longer in the office, instigated during the last days of his office as a desperate attempt to turn the tide of history, not only to reverse the recent election results, but to reverse decades of struggle against racism that have yielded very important victories. The insurrectionists and many Trump supporters around the country have been persuaded by the demagogy of the last 4 years that because there has been some progress in struggles for justice for Black, Latinx, Indigenous, other people of color, that white people have necessarily suffered as a result. In other words, they interpret what we see as the beginning of racial justice to be white oppression. They assume that communities of color can only move forward if white people are relegated to positions historically occupied by Black and other people of color. But I think what they fail to recognize is that when Black people achieve progress, it almost always means better conditions for poor white people. They misread the increasing impoverishment of white people by failing to recognize the destructive impact of capitalism, global capitalism, racial capitalism. And in that context, I just want to point out that we recently learned that the wealth of billionaires in this country, there are about 660 billionaires in the US, has increased tremendously during this pandemic. From it's up something like almost 40%. And as we already know, their total wealth, the wealth of 660 individuals is 2/3 higher than the wealth held by the bottom half of the population. So I just want to say parenthetically that Naomi Klein's analysis of disaster capitalism helps us to understand what is happening here. And so to conclude this answer, I would say that the insurrection on January 6th was in a sense a microcosmic representation of the failed efforts of the last period to turn back the clock, not only with respect to challenges to racism, but also patriarchy, transphobia, climate justice, the assaults on the working class. It seems to me that it represented a desperate effort to return to a time when racism, misogyny, environmental pollution, and all of this represented the uncontested foundation of our social realities. And of course I could go on, but I think I'll stop there.
Okay. Now, I think it's very important that you mentioned this notion that this is a zero-sum game. If an oppressed group gets more privileges or more rights rather than privileges, and it's not a win-win situation. We know it also on Palestine on the ground. That, most Israeli Jews would think that any enhancement or improvement in Palestinian rights means that their rights are going to be diminished. And therefore, this is really a general comment, which I think is important for many of us. And I'm also glad that you mentioned how important supremacism, white supremacism, was at the heart of this attack on Capitol Hill. And I don't want to sound idiosyncratic, but I want to be a voice to many Palestinians who live in America, but I think not only in the United States, who noticed something that in spite of all the whirlwind that went around, you know, the 7th of January, the 8th of January, 2 days after it all happened. And we could not but notice that our small agenda, so to speak, our attempt to make America a place where the Palestinian narrative is being heard, where the case of Palestine is not ignored. We could not miss Nancy Pelosi's, initial structured speech, or the first speech she gave in a structured way after the events. She started the speech by referring to an Israeli poet, someone who wrote a poem about Israel, how Israel changed because his vision of settler colonialist state, of a white settler colonialist state, did not really unfold. And she used that as a quote to start her speech. And then she went on to mention a visit she did for a Holocaust museum in Israel. And if you came out of Mars and you listened to her, you would have thought that a group of anti-Semites and anti-Zionists have attacked the Capitol Hill. And this was the essence of it. There is something there that I don't know, feels that ignoring, of course, the white supremacism is the main ideological motive behind this mob that was incited by Trump. And then you would think there's such a reservoir of poems, of events, even in her lifetime, that she could have relied on so as to give the right context for what you just said, Angela, that it is a surprise that it happened, but overall, it was bound to happen because white supremacism is not dead. And this last president made sure that it doesn't even stay on low fire, that this is really being ignited again and again. So I wonder whether you also kind of, is this very idiosyncratic to those of us who are concerned about Palestine, or there's still this sense that almost like when President Obama, after he was elected, one of the first venues he went to was to AIPAC. I was so surprised to see that even in that dramatic moment in America's life, they appeared there as well. I mean, the Israeli narrative and their supporters in the Democratic Party, which of course for us in Palestine is very worrying in many ways.
Yeah, well, as you know, the political establishment in this country, particularly the Democratic Party, as well as the Republican Party, are closely linked to Zionism. But let me begin by making another point. I think it's really important to identify connections between anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism. And I think it's important to remember the historical alliances that brought Black and Jewish communities together to speak out against the violence that was inflicted on both communities by groups such as the Ku Klux Klan and the White Citizens Council. Growing up in the city of Birmingham, Alabama, which was the most segregated city in the US. I remember that when Black churches were bombed, Jewish synagogues were also bombed. So I want to be clear about the importance of making that connection. But at the same time, I think that Nancy Pelosi is probably reluctant to acknowledge the fact that charges of anti-Semitism have been so tied to critiques of the state of Israel and existing political discourse that these historical linkages of racism and anti-Semitism are not recognized in the way they should be. And of course, under the occupation of Palestine by the state of Israel, Palestinians suffer forms of oppression that are akin to the ways in which Black people have been treated in the US. And I've been following the case of the killing of Ahmed Erekat, who is the cousin of my friend and comrade Noor Erekat. And his killing is so reminiscent of the killing of Mike Brown in Ferguson. He was killed as he was raising his hands. And of course, we all remember the slogan, "Hands up, don't shoot." So I think I would say, let me just say, I think that these historical alliances and recognitions of the kinship between anti-Black racism, white supremacy, anti-Semitism, they have to be brought to the fore in a way that also highlights the Israeli occupation of Palestine and the dispossession of the Palestinian people. And so I think that we really have to challenge the efforts to define anti-Semitism as a critique of the state of Israel.
Absolutely. Angela, let me move ahead for another topic. You've devoted your life to the struggle.
Sorry, Ilan, can I interrupt for just a second? Professor Davis, we've lost your video feed. Would it be possible for you to turn your camera off and on quickly?
Oh, okay, let me stop the video.
Thank you.
Oh, there we are.
Okay, well, I'm so sorry to interrupt.
you.
Carry on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. I didn't notice. Thank you. Angela, you have devoted your life to the struggle for equality, not only of African Americans, but also for women, workers, and marginalized and oppressed groups, not only in the United States, far, far and beyond. But if we focus for a moment on the African American community, I read one of your comments, which really interested me. And this was after the murder of George Floyd, um, and and um, and the widespread activity of the movement for Black Lives. You said that you were encouraged by the reaction among the white community to this particular crime. And the reaction, as we know, was not only in the United States, it really went all over the world. Um, does this reaction, in your eyes, kind of signify a fundamental change in the attitudes to African Americans in the US? And if it is a change, is it how deep is this change? Because myself, I was surprised of how that particular crime, of course, there's so many of them happen even after, yet this particular one seemed to catch the attention of white people, not only in the United States. So is it a sign of encouragement that there's not just a superficial, a reaction, but something more fundamental in your eyes?
Well, first of all, I guess I should say yes. I was really encouraged by the fact that in the aftermath of the lynching of George Floyd and the police killing of Breonna Taylor, more white people participated in anti-racist demonstrations than ever before in the entire history of this country. That was a very heartening. But then, of course, we know that the majority of white people voted for the most recent person to occupy the office of the president. And the fact that the majority of white women voted for him. So I was encouraged and at the same time really deeply disappointed. I was encouraged by the fact that that it seems that, and this is, I think, the change that is represented. And I'm not sure about the lasting character of that change. I think that will be determined by the work that we do. But it seems to me that those mass mobilizations that took place after the police murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor represented a kind of collective coming to consciousness about structural racism that has been long overdue. For too long, racism has been regarded as an individual flaw, a defect that can be removed by learning how not to express racist attitudes or use racist language. And of course, the whole focus has been on distinguishing oneself as not a racist. How many times have we heard the phrase, I am not a racist? How many times have we heard the phrase, I don't see race? Or I've had people tell me, well, I don't think of you as a Black person. So these efforts to challenge racism have been so overdetermined by this individualist approach that's very much connected to neoliberal ideologies and capitalist approaches that it's been very difficult to create a public discourse about institutional and structural racism, about racism that is deeply embedded in the structures of policing, incarceration, and healthcare, and education, and housing. So my analysis of what happened in May is that of the collective witnessing of the murder of George Floyd amounted to something similar to the audience of a lynching. Because we all saw that video, the last 8 minutes of his life, and we were all aware that everyone else was watching. And of course, in the historical lynching parties, white people were supposed to be amused by watching the slow death of a Black person, which happened over and over in the aftermath of Reconstruction, the latter 1800s, the beginning of the 1900s. And it seems to me that that moment when we were watching the death of George Floyd and aware of the fact that we were part of a large collective witnessing it, it allowed for the emergence of a new consciousness. And not automatically or spontaneously, because this consciousness has been cultivated by young activists associated with the Black Lives Matter movement. And we can go back to the movements that began in response to the killing of Trayvon Martin and the failure to hold the vigilante murderer accountable. So it's important, I think, to point out that activists and academics have been using this notion of structural racism for many, many decades. But it was superseded in popular discourse by the concept of racism as simply a trait of the individual. This is why people could say when Obama was elected to the office of the presidency, there were those who argued that we were entering into a post-racial era. I think it's also important to point out and to remember that we were at the beginning of the pandemic then. And the most striking example of structural racism was the fact that disproportionate numbers of Indigenous and Black and Latinx people were being infected and were dying from COVID-19. And so I think that those police killings helped to consolidate a popular awareness of structural racism and its impact on policing. And so therefore, I remain optimistic that it is possible to build on that collective recognition and to begin to develop strategies that are specifically targeting structural racism in all of these institutions.
A particular heinous and callous side of institutional racism in the United States, which attracted your attention, was of course the prison system. You also mentioned it just a few minutes ago, and especially the crimes of sterilization and incarceration. And you are a great advocate both for defunding the police and abolition, which of course would be the most difficult challenge for anyone facing institutional racism. And I think this would also would resonate with many of our Black people in Britain who would feel that the prison system is probably the most hidden side and yet the most brutal side of institutional racism, even if it's more visible in the police force or in daily encounters of the Black community in Britain with the authorities. You've been in it for many, many years, Angela, and I just wonder whether you have any hope from the Biden administration regarding these particularly ugly and cruel manifestation of racist institutional racism as they appear in particularly in the prison system. That even without being experts, I think many of us outside the United States are quite familiar with and quite horrified by it. And to add, of course, the neoliberal aspect to it, the privatization of the prison system, which just kind of added the most cynical, sinister, I think, aspect to an already, as I said before, brutal system.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any hope for the Biden administration in this? Or any hope at all without the Biden administration for changing it?
Well, first of all, I am glad that at least for the moment we were able to use the electoral system to defeat the onslaught of fascism. So it's important to point that out. At the same time, Biden's past positions don't necessarily give me hope, nor do Harris's. But what I do believe is that they are more susceptible to the kind of pressure emanating from, organized movements than the previous president. So I have hope, but I don't simply have hope in the Biden administration. I have hope in the fact that there are many newly, I was going to use the term radicalized, but then I'm aware of the way that has turned into a term that has nothing to do with what we are doing. But the fact that there are so many young people who ally themselves with politically radical and progressive positions, that my hope is that we will continue to put the pressure on those in office. Of course, we have to remember that Biden was one of the main architects of the 1994 crime bill, which is in part responsible for the emergence of what we call, mass incarceration. It was good to see that the day before yesterday, Biden issued an executive order which ends contracts with private prison companies. But I think it's important to point out that we challenge and we stand up against the privatization of prisons, not because we think that a prison system that is not privatized will work, but rather the privatization of prisons represents the role that capitalism has played in a larger sense in the development of a racist-inspired mass incarceration. Federal prisons make up a pretty small fraction of the US prison system. And private prison companies run about 12 federal prisons that house about 9% of all federal prisoners. So simply ending contracts with private prison companies is not going to bring major transformations. The overwhelming majority of the more than 2 million people who are incarcerated in the US are in state and county and local prisons or jails and prison in Indian country. And they're also in immigrant detention facilities. Private prisons house about 8% of all incarcerated people. So that it's important, especially for those of us who are trying to point out the economic dimension of mass incarceration and the way in which it is linked to global capitalism and the deindustrialization processes that took people's jobs and access to housing and healthcare and the dismantling of the welfare state. All of that is so important to understand the pivotal role that capitalism has played in the production of such a huge carceral system. But simply targeting private prisons is not going to fundamentally change anything else, because we actually see privatization within state-owned and run facilities, the privatization of healthcare, the privatization of goods and services, the companies that provide meals, the companies that provide all of the appliances that prisoners order. So simply ending contracts with private prisons does not in any way begin to disrupt the relationship of prisons, the carceral system, to the system of global capitalism. So there hasn't been structural change. And I think that the structural change can come. And it can come from an insistence on abolition that's made by organized groups of people who are resisting. Let me tell you, Ilan, that I've been writing about, along with many other people, abolition since, I guess, since the 1970s. Since in 1971, the prisoners staged an uprising at Attica, a radical uprising in which they called for abolition. And since then, of course, we've developed a very strong abolitionist movement, particularly a movement that recognizes the importance of gender and the connections with movements to challenge sexual violence. But I never imagined that abolitionist discourse would enter the mainstream in my lifetime. So I have to say that I remember the way we talked about abolition as if it were so far in the future that we would never have a chance to witness this kind of moment where there's serious engagement with the question of creating new modes of addressing health and safety and security. That's basically what the movement to defund the police and abolish prisons is all about. It's about imagining and developing new institutions that can better address the question of safety and security in our society.
So talking about hope and capitalism and its impact, not just on the prison system and beyond, maybe it's a good moment to talk a little bit about the left. We have something in common in our biography. We both were members of the Communist Party. And as social activists, I think we, despite the differences between the United States and what goes on in historical Palestine, I think there was one common kind of feature that troubles people who are on the left, not just in the United States or in Palestine. And you wrote a lot about it, and I learned a lot about it, and still we are facing here a certain challenge that goes on. And this is the kind of tension between politics of identity on the one hand, and the politics of identity that we support, either because we are part of that politics of identity or because we feel that it's our need to support that particular politics of identity on the one hand. And our awareness as people on the left of the wish for a wholesale social revolution, stressing class consciousness and determination, and looking for not politics of identity as much as politics of identification and solidarity. The feeling is that both in the United States, I suppose even in Britain, definitely in Palestine, the attempt to bring together, for instance, in historical Palestine, not only to bring together the Palestinian victims of Zionism with what Ella Shohat used to call the Jewish victims of Zionism, and to create a kind of a coalition, a rainbow coalition, has not worked very well, because nationalism, sometimes religious fanaticism, and politics of identity stood in the way. we know it in our movement for struggling for one democratic state, that we are aware that what we are struggling for is not just this kind of solidarity, but also that we want to convince people that we are part of the Arab world, and that we don't want Israel to be a bastion of the West. You always struggled to bridge over the politics of identification with the particular agendas of politics of identity. I think that a time that we see how neoliberal capitalist regimes have utterly failed in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, how the whole system is not able, without some sort of a social welfare policy and nationalization, they're unable to deal, even to begin to deal with both the economic crisis and the health crisis. This is a moment where the left may have to go back to its basic challenges and ask, can we this time have a stronger agenda that connects between the different struggles, first of all, locally, but of course also internationally. And I hope that, like me, you feel that there are indications that, of course, there is the option to do this. The question is, of course, will we be able to exhaust this opportunity that history has given us? I wonder, what are your thoughts on this one?
Well, I guess I would say, first of all, that many activists in the Black Lives Matter movement and in other movements that focus very specifically on racial justice recognize that racial justice is inconceivable without the prospect of economic transformation and an end to capitalism. I still believe that revolutionary transformation absolutely requires a thoroughgoing challenge to capitalism. And some of us have never seen the struggle against racism separately from the struggle against capitalism. Because there are those who simply assume that bringing Black people higher up on the economic ladder, that is to say, incorporating, diversifying the capitalist leadership, is going to bring about an end to racism. But regardless of who actually is at the helm of these efforts, whether it's white people or people of color, the structures still remain the same. And I think that it's important to recognize that class consciousness is always linked to race and gender. I really like, I like Stuart Hall's formulation: race is the modality in which class is lived. And I am also heartened by the fact that increasing numbers of people are beginning to use the term that was introduced by Cedric Robinson, that is to say, racial capitalism. That capitalism has always been in relation to racism, that colonialism and slavery are at the very foundations of the development of capitalism, the primitive accumulation about which Marx writes. And so the challenge is to keep these things in tension, to recognize that they are not separate struggles. For too long, the left has assumed that the struggle to end capitalism is a white working class struggle. The working class has been largely defined as white in Europe and in the US. And struggles against racism have been assumed to only occupy the terrain of civil rights. and I think now we're recognizing that not only must the struggle against racism be central to challenges to capitalism, but challenges to racism cannot really move in a radical direction without also challenging capitalism. And so I'm thinking about the trajectory of movements over the last period during the first decades of the 21st century. And let's not forget that it was the Occupy movement that began to demonstrate that it was possible to develop large, massive movements that were not necessarily organized in the way they were before. But I see my video is somehow not working.
You're back. You're back. We can see you again. That's okay.
I don't usually look at myself, but then I saw that I was frozen. So yeah, so I think that it's so essential to realize that the major struggles for democracy that have been effective, at least in this part of the world, have been initiated by Black people and people of color. And to simply relegate these struggles to identity politics is not helpful. I think that everyone benefits when Black people make demands that allow us to move forward. Not only other people of color, and not only white progressive people, but the white people who assume that in order for their lives to matter, Black lives have to be snuffed out. So I think that we're in the process of consolidating a left movement. The left does not look like it used to look. It has a very new face, new faces, I would say. And it has been so essential for us here in the US who are involved in these struggles to be able to learn from the Palestinian struggles. And I can't emphasize enough that this current moment in our movement against racism has been in many ways assisted by Palestinian activists. And I'm referring to the fact that back in 2014, when the Ferguson protest happened, and that it was Palestinians in Palestine who provided the first example of international solidarity with Black movements unfolding here. And as such, Palestinians were in the leadership of a global movement of solidarity. And we've also learned so much about the importance of broadening our notion of carcerality. And of course, you've pointed out that Palestine is the largest prison in the world. And so how do we engage in struggles for abolition in this country while recognizing that oftentimes methods that are used to decarcerate spread carcerality in the community along trajectories that are very dangerous. And so we have a great deal of gratitude to our Palestinian comrades and sisters and brothers for their work in Palestine, but also for assisting us to become more radical in our understanding of what it is we're doing.
Absolutely, and you referred, and just to our viewers who are not familiar with this, that during the attack on Gaza, in the Gaza Strip itself, people demonstrated in solidarity with Ferguson. was really, really amazing. We are really nearing the end of our conversation, but I want to insert one last point, and we will have to be brief about it, otherwise Katie would mute us mutually. And this is about academic scholarship and activism, because we have a lot of young graduate students and undergraduate students with us, and especially those who work on issues such as Palestine or Black history or decolonization. And they are very much aware that they are fusing scholarship with activism. And quite often they encounter criticism and prejudice and hostile attitude, and all under the guise that what they're doing is not professional enough, is biased, is not objective. I don't have to tell you, you and I have both had our share of such criticism over the years. I have like you, I have great faith in the younger generation, but just to finish our joint conversation, and we'll open it up, and there's so many issues, of course, we didn't manage to talk about, but I'm sure the audience will bring them. We need to kind of articulate a message for the next generation to make sure that they don't see the academia as a separate space in the moral struggle for a just society. And this is not easy. We know the intimidation, the rules of the game, but I just wonder how you feel about the students that you teach, the young people that you are meeting. Do you see a hope here for the continued of moral activism within the scholarly community, or the continuation of organic intellectuals, the making of organic intellectuals, as Antonio Gramsci would put it, as your final contribution to our dialogue, and then we'll open it up.
Well, I would begin by saying that even as we are critical of existing structures of education, including higher education, education matters. Knowledge matters. We cannot engage in successful efforts for radical transformation without knowledge. But at the same time, I think it's important for university-trained academics to acknowledge that knowledge, to recognize that knowledge gets produced in many sites, not only the university. And I might point out that this current moment in the US, when we are engaged in serious conversations about defunding the police and abolishing prisons, many of the ideas emerged from prisoners in prison. And as a matter of fact, I have, over the last years, been involved in the creation of a new field, which is called critical prison studies, an interdisciplinary field that has been embraced by increasing numbers of young scholars. And they recognize that the foundational knowledge of that field comes from prisoners themselves. So I think that it is important to demystify the process of producing knowledge, and at the same time recognizing that scholar activists need the training and the exposure to ideas that the university can offer. But it also means that one has to learn how to both take advantage of these institutions of education and to be critical of them simultaneously, so that the university is not unlike other terrains of struggle, where we have to hold in tension our critiques of the institution and at the same time attempt to take advantage of what is offered us. But I'm very excited because I think that this generation of young scholars is more equipped to engage with addressing the problems of the globe than environmental justice, for example, and of course, racism and heteropatriarchy. I've taught for many years in feminist studies department, and there's still a great deal of tension, particularly within academic feminism. But we've seen the emergence of theories and practices of feminism that disassociate themselves from the old notion that in order to be free, women simply have to try to rise up the ladder and puncture the glass ceiling. So a feminism that is anti-racist, that is anti-capitalist, and that explores intersectionalities is the feminism we need now. It's not always the feminism one sees at the university, but one witnesses the struggles and the tensions and the contradictions. And that is the context within which we always work.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And I'm very proud that in Exeter, I think at least in the Institute, we are trying to create this safe space for this younger generation to feel secure and confident that moral activism and scholarship can go hand in hand, and they should not be afraid, even if our own examples sometimes show a personal price you might pay. But these personal prices are only temporary setbacks, and the continued production of what one can call moral knowledge is essential for the society to move forward. As I said, Angela, there were scores of other issues that we even talked about that before this dialogue. We knew that 45 minutes was really not enough, but I'm sure this is an amazing audience, and they would complement any aspect that we forgot to discuss. And I want to thank you so much. It's been such a great pleasure, and I learned so much. And I think I'm handing it over to Katie again. Am I right, Katie?
You are. Thank you, Ilan, and thank you, Professor Davis, as well. We have the most amazing questions coming from YouTube, from Twitter, and also from Zoom. We're going to get through as many as we can. We'll alternate. I'll pose one question, then you'll respond, and then Asha will pose the next question. So just so our audience knows, we will be using your names to identify the person who posed the question, as we imagine any names that are appearing here are ones that are publicly accessible or publicly available. Also, there was something else I was going to say, and I can't quite remember what that was. So let's just get started. Our first question is coming from Neha Shaji, specifically to Professor Davis. And I do think actually Professor Pape can also feed onto this question as well. The question is related actually to the last point about the kinds of tensions within academia and institutions. So Neha asks, what about white fragility around insurrectionary and anti-racist action? When institutions are simultaneously in fear of, yet desiring the reputation of an aesthetic anti-racism, how do you think activists working in the constraints of an institution would work through such an issue?
How would activists within the context of the university work through the constraints of white fragility? I'm not sure that I understand the question.
I believe that is the question. So perhaps we could invite Neha to clarify in the chat.
Well, let me see if I can, first of all, okay, I have no idea why my camera keeps turning off.
What you can see of you, Angela, we're happy.
Well, you know, I think I would answer that question by pointing to the fact that there is a very long tradition of white involvement in struggles against racism. You know, oftentimes we tend to think too myopically, and we allow our concepts and categories to, in many ways, conceal reality rather than to reveal it. When we use the term white and we talk about white people, that kind of universalizing should not conceal the ways in which white people have been involved in struggles against racism from the very outset. You know, I know that we use terms like white allyship as if white people have to simply make a decision to help their poor sisters and brothers without recognizing that white supremacy and racism they damage all of us. And that if white people can't find ways to identify with that trajectory of white struggles against racism. I was earlier, you know, talking about the fact that when I was a child, the only white people I knew were Jewish people because they were the ones who were involved collaboratively with Black people in the struggle against white supremacist violence in the South. Yeah, you know, what I think was so important about that mobilization that happened last summer was that it seemed that, you know, finally large numbers of white people realized that they had to leave behind the assumption that this has nothing to do with them. And, you know, white people who say, well, I'm not a slave holder. I don't even have ancestors who were slaveholders. So what does this have to do with me? It has to do with all of us if we want to create a democratic society grounded in economic justice. So yeah, that would be my response.
Thank you.
Let's move to the next question, Katie. I think Angela covered it very well.
Thank you. This question is from Kalkadan Ligis. It's to Professor Angela Davis. She asks, do you feel personal pain caused by structural anti-Black racism? And if so, how do you manage that pain to continue to produce the work you do? And has that changed over time?
Well, of course, I experience pain, and not primarily because of my individual situation. You know, I can always recognize that however I might be affected by this structural racism, by racist violence, I'm not the measure of why this system needs to change. When I was in jail facing the death penalty, what became so apparent to me was that I was fortunate enough to have a huge movement, global movement. People all over the world were standing with me. And then on the other hand, I would see women, Puerto Rican women, Black women who were charged with very, very minor crimes, who did not even have the money to pay bail, and who had no one who was attending to their needs. So I think that a kind of compassion and a sense of community is what helps us to figure out how to address the trauma and the pain. We are primed to assume that this is always an individual issue, that we have to figure out how to deal with it within ourselves. But my experience is that it's always collective. It's about community. And if we are going to move in a progressive, along a progressive trajectory, then we have to recognize the interconnections and interrelationalities between ourselves and others in the community, across communities, across nations. Yeah, I guess it might also be important to point out that self-care has become a dimension of activist struggle, emotional self-care, mental self-care, acknowledging of traumas. And I think that this has been a really important gift of the younger generation of activists, that self-care is not about an individual trying to figure out how to take care of herself or himself or their selves, but rather is a collective project.
Thank you very much. We have a question now that's been posed to you both. This is by Kanwal Hamid. From your experience, what makes a movement for social transformation transnational in practice? And what do you see as the role of this transnationalism for local struggles?
Okay, maybe I'll let you answer first, since I've been talking a lot.
Okay, thank you. It's a very good question. I think that you can think about a term that combines global and local. You can call it glocal. Glocalism is as important as transnationalism. I think the word itself, transnational, can create the wrong impression that it's about national movements only. And we are so much aware now of the struggle of indigenous people, of workers suffering from the neoliberal situation. So I think this is much more than transnational. This is the kind of network of identification that I was talking about. And I think this is far easier than we think. For example, if you look as a scholar, but also as an activist, on the phenomenon of settler colonialism, this movement from Europe that led to the elimination of the natives in so many parts of the world, and in the case of Palestine, to the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian. At the heart of settler colonialism, there is dehumanization. The native does not exist and can easily be removed. The worker in a neoliberal economy does not exist, can easily be removed, can easily be fired. These are all the gig kind of employments that we see in Britain. So it's the situation may have different names in different places, but at the heart there is dehumanization of the few against the many in historical situations that go on for too long, and the production of knowledge about these situations continues to distort, sometimes with benevolent terms such as enlightenment, democracy, and progress, oppressive situations. So I think that given the fact that we have now media that we never had before for interaction, for working together, simultaneous interactions and reactions, this is a much better time even, I think, than even before, than creating these huge social movements for a just democratic world that on the one hand has a particular agenda of a certain place, but all together are fighting actually for the same set of values, and have a similar imagination of how a better world looks like. And Angela mentioned the fact that people in the besieged Gaza Strip have never been to Ferguson. I don't think they even found Ferguson on the map, but it resonated with them. What happened there is relevant to them. I participated in a demonstration for better pay in Argentina, in Buenos Aires. And most of the demonstrators donned the Palestinian flag without a lot of knowledge about what was going on in Palestine. But the flag symbolized social injustice, not just justice. And I think that we should be aware that the civil society already talks the language of solidarity, international solidarity. We have a problem with the political elites, the academic elites, the media. The segregation there is manipulative, is on purpose, does not allow for such obvious connections to be visible for their own interest. But we have the right and we have a duty to make it the language that we are talking, whether it's about ecological justice, social justice, decolonization, or whatever. And here the academia has to make sure that it speaks a language that everybody understands, that research is relevant to people, not just to the researchers. And this is something I think we can use for good, in particular during this pandemic, when the elites are faltering, because it's not about war, it's not about peace. Patriotic rhetoric doesn't work. The media doesn't have the experts to explain what to do, because social solidarity is not built top down, it's built from bottom up. And the media cannot build solidarity. Only real people with real concerns and understanding and identification can do this.
Well, should I respond as well? Well, thank you so much, Ilan. That's a really powerful argument, for the building of new structures of international solidarity. I think that solidarity is especially important for people who are engaged in struggle in the US. Because Black people, for example, have always been the recipients of solidarity from the era of slavery, when Frederick Douglass traveled to Ireland and Scotland, and when Ida B. Wells, in organizing the anti-lynching movement, got support during her travels abroad. And I think that that has become a kind of instinct for the world to pay attention to Black struggles in the US. But it also has to do with the ways in which the US has positioned itself globally as the most important spot on the globe, American exceptionalism. And I think that even those of us who have been engaged in struggles against the government of the US, we're oftentimes subject to the ideologies of American exceptionalism. And we forget that as we have been recipients of solidarity over the decades and over the years, over the centuries, that we also have to learn how to generate solidarity with people who are struggling in other parts of the world. That is so central for the continued progressive radical development of the anti-racist movement in the US. And it's important for us to make connections with struggles against settler colonialism. of course, the US is a settler colonial country. And therefore, we can learn a great deal from Palestinians' struggles against settler colonialism, recognizing that Palestine is still subject to that process. Israel is the only settler colonial nation that continues to try to expand. I think that particularly during this period when the technology of communication creates possibilities of communicating across national borders that were not necessarily available to us before, that we need to take advantage of this and share with each other and learn from each other and figure out how we might begin to create global movements against the repressive treatment of immigrants all over the world. And this will also require us to try to popularize analyses of the role that global capitalism is playing in all of this today. It will also require us to, share different feminist approaches. I can say that I feel very sad often when I go to places. Of course, I haven't been anywhere for a long time now, but when I go to Brazil and Brazil asks those of us who are from the US to talk about Black feminism. And then I look at the history of Black feminist struggle in Brazil, and I realize that we in the US would be helped enormously by our awareness of the struggles of Black women in Brazil and the relationship of the fact that Black women are religious leaders within Candomblé and how that has helped to encourage a very different kind of feminism. And ultimately, I think we all want a world in which national boundaries do not define relationships among human beings. Ultimately, I think we want to try to imagine new modes of community that do not depend on the idea of the nation, which after all is a production of capitalism and of the bourgeois advances under capitalism. So yes, I think that international solidarity, I'm going to use the old term international solidarity because I think it still really resonates, that we still need international solidarity.
Thank you. I have a question for you both. The term decolonizing is already being co-opted by people who have never been colonized before. So my question to you both is, in practical terms, what does decolonization mean to you both?
Do you want me to go first, Angela? And then
Absolutely.
yeah, give you some time to rest. Thank you, Asha. Yes, this is a very good question, and I will be a bit egotistic here, I must say, because I'm so embroiled with what's happening in Palestine that I think I have sort of two answers in practical terms. The first one is very local in a sense, but as I said, I hope it's also global, as I said before. It's very important, I think, to appropriate and make sure that people employ the term decolonization when they talk about Palestine. So I will start with the particular. So for me, decolonization is the alternative dictionary or an entry in an alternative dictionary or vocabulary that we should use instead of the one that is used by mainstream media and academia, which is the peace process, an end of the conflict, and so on. Decolonization means that there is no conflict there between two equal parties, that this is not a conflict between two national movements. This is an ongoing settler colonial movement, and the only way of solving the problem there is by decolonizing the land, the minds, the institution, dismantling the colonialist institution. And therefore, for me, decolonization is something I live every moment of my life now, in my writing, in my activism, in my dialogues with Israelis or with Palestinians, and everyone who still believes that the two-state solution is a valid solution, and so on. So that's one meaning, practical meaning. The second one is, of course, whenever I have the time and the energy, because I totally agree with Angela, you need to be inspired and enhanced by an international solidarity of decolonization. And then you realize how wide is this concept, that does not refer to an historical moment of dismantling the colonial empires in the 19th century or the early 20th century. No, this has to do with the way we understand industry, economy, gender relations, the rights of indigenous people, oppressed community, that this is a whole process by which a privileged society would have to understand, with what Angela and I started the conversation, that this is not a zero-sum game. Decolonization does not mean destroying the colonizer, does not mean getting rid of the colonizer as people, as human beings. It means improving life for everyone, for everyone. And I think this is our biggest challenge. How do we translate what Angela told us into a clear agenda of the left, I think, the international left? This ability to come to people in privileged position, in powerful position, and say to them, it's a win-win. You may not see it. You may be frightened by this, but you are not going to stop it. And the more you are part of it, the quicker it would happen and the better it would unfold. And I think that's why decolonization is a very practical, daily action and thought and an imagination of a different world.
Wow, I think you said it perfectly, Ilan. And I guess I would only add that it's a very complex process that happens at many levels. And I'm also thinking of Ngui wa Thiong'o's book, Decolonizing the Mind, that it's also about ideological struggle. Just as you point out, the use of the term decolonization rather than ending the conflict or rather than the peace process makes it very clear that we are talking about historical processes that involve a colonizer and the colonized. Here in the US, we are continuing to emphasize the importance of rendering visible the predicament of indigenous people in this country who have been relegated to invisibility for so long that sports teams have been able to use derogatory names related to Native people without much critique. And of course, that is happening now. That is a process of decolonization. Decolonization, getting rid of structures. In Brazil, I was really happy to be a part of a school that is about decolonial Black feminism. that Black feminism is not simply concerned with changing gender relationships and changing race relations, but also about contesting the part that capitalism has played in underwriting all of these colonial projects. And so I think that that I completely agree with you, Ilan. We need a new lexicon. We need new vocabularies, and that can be transformative. I'm simply thinking about the fact that when many of us first began to do this abolitionist work around prisons, we ask ourselves, how can we begin to encourage a critical stance towards the assumption that crime is responsible for the massive prison buildup? How can we disarticulate crime and punishment and bring a popular understanding of the part that racism plays, the part that capitalism plays in the prison buildup, in mass incarceration? And so we began to use the term prison industrial complex. And that actually helped to shift the conversation away from individuals who committed crimes and therefore deserved punishment to the ways in which the economic system, the political system were very much responsible for this growth in the numbers of people incarcerated. So yeah, I think decolonization, that represents the trajectory we have to move along in the future.
Amazing. Thank you for those incredible responses. It feels like the absolute perfect way to end this conversation, which I'm very sorry to do, but you are busy people and you've given us so much of your time so generously. I think what I'm going to take away a lot, but something that was said quite early on by Professor Davis, that if changes are to be lasting, that will be determined by the work that we do. That's on us, everybody. So let's get started. Thank you again so much to Professor Davis, to Professor Pape, to the whole crew that made this happen, to the inimitable Asha Ali, and to everyone who's joined us this evening. If you can turn your cameras on and we can unspotlight, we can give our speakers a round of applause, standing ovation, as you wish. Thank you all. We'll make the recording available in just a little bit on the YouTube channel, so be watching for that. I'm going to be listening a few times over at the very least. And again, thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.